literacy and numeracy. So now when states are starting to make these rules, now we can sort of come in and say, okay, maybe this is not the right way, right? So yeah, with NEP, I think that's really where we are in sort of assessing whether it can be inclusive or improve inclusion in some sense. Yeah. Sorry, was there a second half of that question that I missed answering?
No, I think you're pretty much because we wanted you to kind of review NEP for our listeners, So
Right.
is there anything more that you would like to add to this? You talked about some of the unanimous, positives, and is there anything that you anticipate in terms of maybe something that the government might have to relook or?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing is definitely that, the NEP is really talking about changing the focus of education or the goal setting essentially to learning outcomes. So this is an important piece because when the right to education came out, the legislation came out, one of the largest critiques of it was that the Right to Education Act only focuses on inputs, right? So it says, let's build physical schools, let's build infrastructure in those schools, let's do, X, Y, Z. These are all just inputs where you are spending money on tangible things and you are providing that to students. But everyone was saying that, even if children will access these schools, where is attendance, where is quality, where is learning, right? So the NEP sort of starts talking about learning outcomes as the primary goal setting aspect, and it sort of situates that within RT came in like 2009, 2010. And we've been able to achieve near 100% enrollment. You've made great strides in terms of providing those inputs. So now let's focus on learning. But there has been, a lot of sort of criticism back and forth from different academics who are saying that, yes, learning is important, but we have to ensure that you don't make learning you don't make measuring learning something very, very simplified in the sense that you can't set goals. For example, when they talk about foundational literacy and numeracy, Nipun Bharat is setting goals like, children should be able to read at this speed. So these many, words within 30 seconds or 60 seconds or something like that, which is fine for measuring it, sure. But then what about the, interactive process of learning, socio-emotional, like where are these other sort of soft aspects, right? So that is one criticism. And then the other thing is, of course, that now that COVID has happened, right? Like I said, this digital divide has really taken us back many, many years in terms of the access problem that we had earlier solved. So, the panel discussion we hosted on last Friday, we had Atishi Manlena was one of our panel discussants, and she specifically pointed to this. And she said, over the last maybe 20 years, we had really solved that access wala problem. You had children coming to schools, and now we've gone back to like the 90s, right? We've gone back to the basic problems of our children going to be able to come to school. Are they going to be just that basic access problem? We've just gone back in time. So I think one really important part is, are states now going to include that in their interpretation of NEP, right? Like that is now a really important aspect that is kind of, I guess, missing, and we have to, hopefully they will address that. Yeah.
Great. So before I move on to my last question with you for the in conversation between us, and then we move on to the Q&A. In
Right.
fact, Nisha, you've given us a wonderful opportunity to also think about and then, ask you this question with reference to, I come to the point directly, mental health. Since you talk about speed of reading or whatever, accessibility, but when it comes to learning outcomes, so how does this is kind of a soft problem which we are yet to fully address,
Mm-mm.
so could you talk briefly about this and then we move to Q&A then?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, mental health is something that, yeah, absolutely, it's not something that's discussed enough. It's obviously not something that we'd want to evaluate as such in schools, but it is something that you want to, be aware of. You want parents and teachers, especially, to be, much more aware of. And I think when you talk about something like mental health, again, there is like a disadvantage, it is sort of intersecting with or is going to disproportionately affect children from certain backgrounds, right? So, for example, children with disabilities, transgender children. A lot of these children are sometimes, more susceptible to, say, bullying in a school, which can have direct impacts on their mental health. Then this entire focus on learning outcomes. So this is again something that people are worried about. We've seen with board exams over so many years, the pressure that mounts on a child because of board exams, and that's the pressure that we're all putting on that child. It's not necessarily something that they have put on themselves. All of us together, the system is putting that pressure on the child that you have to do well in your boards, or you won't get a job, there's no future, etc. And you see like incredibly high suicide rates amongst young children in India because of that, right? Like with mental health, I think when you talk about how education policy can maybe address that, I think there is only so much we can do. One is maybe having genuine conversations and raising awareness about mental health amongst the key stakeholders and the support systems of the child, as well as children themselves. Then there's also, maybe we can move towards actually having mental health professionals in schools. So a lot of elite schools, especially in other countries in sort of the developed world, you will see mental health counselors in schools that are available to students and teachers and parents, pretty much all the time. So maybe that can also then be, another piece of it. And then I think also sort of, identifying that there are going to be certain groups of children who might be more disproportionately affected, like I said. So even, for example, children from lower caste groups, female children, girl children with disabilities who might be much more susceptible to abuse or assault. It's all of these children who sort of need to be given special attention. And again, it comes back to sort of understanding some of those problems and then providing or creating spaces where people feel free to say, this is a problem, we need to solve it, right? Or this is how I'm feeling and we need to solve it. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that needs to be addressed. But I guess within education policy, there's maybe only so much we can do. It really is a health, a problem for the health side of policy.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And in connection with what we have discussed, we have a lot of questions also from our participants. So we move to our Q&A round now, and I request our student Somesh to moderate the Q&A round for us. Somesh.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, before starting with the questions of the audience, there is a personal question from my side. Ma'am, recently, according to a UNESCO report, India has a deficit of over 1 million teachers, and even 30% of the current teaching workforce will need to be replaced. And ma'am, according to another report, primary education, mainly the early childhood education, has the most share in this deficit. As you mentioned about the national education policy, we have ideas to improve, but I don't think we are currently focusing on whether we have enough teachers for the early childhood education or not. According to you, what should be the priority? New policies or the improvement in teaching system?
So I mean, it's that exact. This is a really good question, firstly, Somesh. So I mean, definitely it comes back to that supply side, demand side problem that I'm talking about, right? So of course, the entire teacher workforce is 100% supply side problem that the state needs to solve for. And you are absolutely right. We do have a shortage of teachers, but it's not just it's not as simple as saying there is a shortage, right? Because a shortage would imply that to appoint teachers, there are not enough trained teachers. But if you actually look at it, so we did a study specifically on special educators, but the same has been done for other stages of education and for non-special educators, where you actually see that you have a large group of trained teachers who've gone through, say, the TET tests for to be employed as a government teacher, who've done all the required things, but appointments in the government schooling system are very, very slow. Right. And there is, I mean, there's often not a clear understanding of why. Like, is it just a bureaucratic constraint? Like, is it just a, all government processes are being a little slow? This is true. But you really do see that. And in the study that we did with special educators, we had so many special educators saying that, I live in this rural area. I thought I would get this degree because in my rural area, there is no school for children with disabilities, and I wanted to solve that problem. So I got the degree, but there's still no school, so there's no one to appoint me, right? So it's as simple as that. And you had many of them saying, it's been 10 years of me trying to get appointed in a government school. I've gone through the process so many times. I've done the tests. I've updated my credentials, but I'm not being appointed, right? So that's one side of it. On the other side, what you're talking about, this EC problem, 100%, there is a huge shortage. And like I said, the Anganwadi worker, she is not a trained educator, right? The Anganwadi worker is basically, they are treated as volunteer workers. That's their designation, or that's how they're hired. So they're paid an honorarium of like 4,000 to 8,000 rupees per month, depending on which state you're talking about. And they perform everything from health, nutrition, immunization for children from 0 to 6 years. They also take care of nutrition supplementation and health of pregnant mothers, lactating mothers, so like neonatal, prenatal care, all of that. They also sort of provide schemes for adolescent girls. So you have a single Anganwadi worker who you're not calling a formal employee, who's doing so many different things. Plus, you're asking them to also do preschool education, and you're not training them enough, right? You are training them, there is training, but is it enough, right? So, I mean, the problem for EC is really to say, should we be supplementing the Anganwadi worker, right? So do Anganwadis need, say, a third employee who will just do education, for example, who is well trained to do early childhood education? Maybe that's a solution, but then do we have the budget for it, right? So the teacher shortage problem is also a constraint problem, where you might have many teachers who have tried to get the credentials and be appointed, but the process is too slow. Many of them lose interest. Many of them also get appointed in very remote rural areas, which are just, the living conditions are maybe not sufficient. They're not given enough support to take care of themselves, so they don't want to go. There are many of these, other problems. And with EC, really, it is a budget problem, because you have, say, 14 lakh Anganwadis that have two people employed, one Anganwadi worker, one helper, who are doing this entire ambit of things. If you want to employ just one additional person in each of these places, how much is that going to cost, right? And this is on top of Anganwadi workers and helpers already protesting, saying we don't get enough money, which I personally 100% agree with. They are essentially the backbone of, the entire sort of prenatal, neonatal healthcare system, as well as preschool education, and they're treated as sort of informal workers almost, right? So yeah, I mean, it is this huge problem of, yes, there is a shortage, but do we have the money to solve that problem? And what do you prioritize? I hope that a little bit answered your question. If I just stated more problems, sorry,
Thank you.
Somesh.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the answer. But even there, in a report, it was been stated that over 1 lakh schools are there. Only single teacher are being appointed there for the
Yeah,
Anganwadi.
yeah.
That's also the issue here. And
No,
ma'am, there is
100%.
another.
So yeah, sorry. If you want to move on, we can move on.
Yes, ma'am, please you proceed.
No. So I was saying that is also definitely a problem. You have, the NEP talks about creating school complexes to address the problem of a single teacher teaching multiple grades in schools where there is low, enrollment of students. You have maybe 20 children across an entire school, maybe across 5 grades, and then you have one teacher appointed to teach all of them. And then, of course, your teacher absenteeism, so to speak, becomes a sort of function of not having enough teachers there, right? Or like one teacher trying to teach multiple grades within the same physical classroom at the same time. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, these are all problems that you need to solve. And the big conundrum with this, Somesh, is that what the NEP is saying is, in a sense, rationalize these schools. So close these small schools and include them in, a cluster of a bigger school, so you have more resources. But when you do that, right, do you take away the access problem? Because this small school was set up because it was close to your house, right? It was set up to meet that 1 kilometer radius problem. So now if I shut down this school because there are too few children and too few teachers, and I put it into this bigger school that is further away, are these 20 children going to stop coming to school? So this is really the conundrum. How do you solve both these problems, right? what is the sort of Pareto optimal solution, if you may? Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the answer. And the another question is by Shreyas. Are socio-demographics a challenge in themselves for urban school systems? They speak to the broader social and economic inequities facing such populations that invariably frame the work of urban schools.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
And it is that are socio-demographics a challenge in themselves for urban school systems? They speak to the broader social and economic inequities facing such population that invariably frame the work of urban schools.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I fully understood this question. So I mean, if whoever asked it would like to elaborate, I'd be happy to do that. Or if that's okay, or I can just.
Shreyas, could you unmute yourself and kind of express your idea of this question? Can you? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Very good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, the question says that the socio-demographic a challenge in themselves for urban school system. Like they speak about the broader social and there's a lot of economic inequalities in the urban schools. So how to handle that in the urban school system? Basically, the question, that idea of the question is that what laws do we need for that?
Okay, got it. So like there's this. This is honestly more of the problem. I don't know if I always have, as in I usually won't have solutions, right? That's sort of what I'm dedicating my work life to do, is to find those solutions. I don't have a direct solution for you. But yeah, you're absolutely right. What does happen is, the group, like the composition of a classroom, right? Within an urban school or a rural school for that matter, but specifically an urban school, the composition of the classroom is really going to determine how children learn and how much inclusion, exclusion happens, all of that, right? So if I can again, I'll start with an example, and I think this will help me answer the question. So we did this study when I was working in Ahmedabad on parental preference for government and private schools. And what we were doing was looking at, within a 1 kilometer radius, we spoke to about 60 or 70 households that were attending government schools. And within that 1 kilometer radius, there was like access to about, I think, 4 government schools and 3 private schools. So, pretty well done in terms of RP implementation norms or whatever. So they had they had sort of choice between government schools. And what we saw happen was that at the subcaste level, there was actually households were segregating into like government schools. So anyone who was a little bit economically well off was able to go to a low fee private school, and they considered that to be better than the government school, right? Whether or not is up for debate, but they considered that to be better. They preferred it. So anyone who could afford it, and these are low fee private schools where fees is like 200 to 500 rupees per month. Okay, that's what we're talking about. So they were going to those schools. So there was like a class divide happening there, right? Then within the government schools as well, you had people who were on paper, they're considered like, or they're written as scheduled caste, right, households. But within them, they had separated into lower subcaste and higher subcaste within scheduled caste. And the higher subcaste within scheduled caste was saying, we go to this government school because the lower subcaste goes to that government school, right? So there's this invisible almost, and honestly there's not enough evidence of this for across India, but you see this kind of segregation happen even within government schools, and then definitely between private and government schools, right? That's obvious. There's a clear economic barrier to going into a private school. So then this composition of socioeconomic disadvantage in schools, what that does is it kind of like continues the cycles of disadvantage later on, right? If you have children only going to, one is there is evidence that when you have children from different socioeconomic backgrounds in the same school, it actually has benefits for, say, pro-social behavior. It has benefits for sort of, attitudes towards equality, etc. So in a sort of long-term position, we want to remove segregation from the schooling system, right? But then when you have this kind of segregation, which is almost invisible, it's almost a question of, do we need to be, I don't know, how do you solve this with a policy, right? If it's something that we haven't even been able to properly document yet, we don't have the data for it. This is something that I have like anecdotal experience in, right? Because I saw it happen in this small little situation. So I mean, that's really what we need to think about. And then as far as policy is concerned, maybe what I think the Delhi government tried to bring in, like an inclusive curriculum and a gender curriculum, these kinds of things where you try to talk about differences, right? In a way that you try to create sort of pro-social behaviors and pro-social attitudes towards inclusion and exclusion, right? So, I mean, I don't know if there is a clear sort of solution for what can we do to improve the situation in urban schools, because there is so much segregation. So you can only try to solve for the, exclusion problem when you have people mixed into a class and you can actually talk to them about what that means. If everyone going to a school is, say, only, only Muslim, only low income, or only like lower subcaste schedule, like, how are you going to talk about that problem if everyone's divided into these little groups? So, yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the answer. There's another question by Jay Badruka. How much effort does it take to convince the government organization with the solution that is provided from your end?
Yeah, this is this is, I mean, it's honestly, it's a it's a never-ending process, and especially with development sectors like education and health, etc. These are not policies that change very often, right? So if you look at the RT Act, it was something that was advocated for like some 20 years. To make amendments to the RT Act or to even state rules of an RT Act is a very long process, right? It's not something that you can't make edits like every year or something like that, right? That's not going to happen. So it's really about trying to go to the government with evidence, and you say, this is the evidence that we've collected. This is the backing that we have from these kinds of organizations or our own work, and then you have to really convince them that this works for them. And at the end of the day, it is like, it is a democratic, it's a political system, right? So what I was saying about having that, not just the social and cultural buy-in, but you also need to have the political buy-in. And at any point of time, even at like, regardless of who the government official is, at any point of time, they are going to be concerned with, will this look good for me? Right? Apart from, is this going to be good for my community? And yes, you would think that if it's good for the community, it's good for you. But, bureaucrats, like look at a ward councillor, they are there for a term of what, like 4 years, 5 years, right? They have to be re-elected. And if you tell them, let's work on learning outcomes, or let's work on early childhood education, which has a like you will see gains in 10 years, that's not useful for them, right? Why would they invest in that? Because they might not get, as opposed to investing in something tangible and physical. So they'll say, let's not do, early childhood education, let's build another school, right? Or let's do this tangible thing. Everyone can see I've done this, and they'll be happy. So it's very difficult to sort of convince everyone. And like, let's be fair as well. I am coming in and saying, at like whatever 28, I have done this research and I'm telling you this evidence is perfect and this is 100% going to solve the problem. I don't know 100% is going to solve the problem. I'm making an educated estimation based on the research I've done, based on my methodology. Them being convinced by me is then also their choice, right? Like they can then decide if that's good enough. And then you have to go back to that feedback loop. So you have to be ready to say, government bought in, they tried it in this one ward and then it failed, right? People said it failed. And so then we have to rework that entire thing. So it is a very, very long process. And definitely in development sectors, it's even longer. And the stakes are really, really high. So the government is not always willing to budge. They don't always have the budget to budge. And then you really have to, work with what their incentives are as well, which is only fair. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the answer. And the next question is from our faculty, Miss Apurva Thakur. Does caste have a role to play in urban school settings?
Yeah, yes, 100%. I mean, the example that I just gave, caste is really that, as much as we talk about it, it is really that invisible barrier, right? It's this like constructed barrier that really affects every aspect of a person's life, right? Because see, when we talk about disadvantage, right, whether you're talking about class, caste, religion, whatever it is, whatever that disadvantage, like the form of the disadvantage might be, what you're really talking about is equality of opportunity right? So do we all have equal opportunity to say access something, and within that equality of opportunity, is there, does everyone have the equal freedom to exercise choice, right? And so when you talk about caste, it's really, that's where it sort of comes down to, right? Because what you're saying is, I had, in that Ahmedabad example I just gave you, I had 3 government schools in front of me, but I was only able to choose one school because of some invisible lower subcaste situation where everyone else sort of said that I'm not going to send my child to school if your child goes to that school, right? So yeah, I mean, this is the kind of way in which caste operates, right? And then along the way, like, as in, we know it's been in the news right now in UP, right? Like the um, girl children of lower caste groups being much more susceptible to abuse in society, right? Like these are very much caste crimes. They're not just crimes against gender. They're very much about that as well, right? So in a situation where you are more unsafe, and caste is also very much associated, because of the lack of equality of opportunity, it's very much associated with your your class as well. They become tied together, as when they have been historically tied together because of this. So I mean, like it becomes like a situation where you haven't had these opportunities and you're more unsafe, you're economically worse off. There are these invisible barriers due to which you're discriminated your entire life. That's going to have repercussions on your health. That's going to have repercussions on every other aspect of your life, right? So I mean, yes, 100%. I mean, yeah, you can't talk about inclusion without talking about the problems of the caste group. But I mean, if you have a specific question though about like caste and education, we can definitely discuss that in greater detail as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And the next question is from Siddhi. And you spoke about the mental health. There is a stigma that is attached to talking to a professional, and people you are hesitant to take up the therapy. Also, when we speak of mental health, the accessibility gets a little difficult due to the fact that therapy is expensive. What are your suggestions to tackle these problems?
So, I mean, again, this is education policy can only do so much to address the mental health crisis. As far as the stigmatization aspect is concerned, I do think we can, schools can play a role, right? Like I said, we can talk about it more. We can try to be open about it. We can try to destigmatize it, try to sort of identify within schools children that are more or less susceptible to mental health, issues. But what we really need, I think, is to treat, like, what we need is a mental health bill, right? What we need is a mental health policy that is very much a part of the health system, right? It needs to be treated at par with any other health crisis. And once you sort of identify it as such, then what you really need to be talking about is we need government mental health centers, right? The way you have government hospitals, you need that as well. So you need to make mental health accessible universally, across the board. So you can continue to have your elite providers of mental health like we do right now, the same way that we have private schools or, XYZ, but you really do need to make mental health universal and accessible, the same way you're trying to make hospitals and, health more broadly accessible to everyone free of cost, right? But yeah, again, this is very much, you need a mental health bill. And actually, for those who are interested, Vidhi's health team is actually working on a mental health bill at the moment. So you should definitely check out their work. It's, yeah, I can send the link to Vidya ma'am to share with everyone if that's of interest. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you also for sharing the link of the Vidhi. There's another question by Jinisha. Residents of rural India usually come with little income sources, which are usually consumed in the basic survival, making education out of their reach. The lack of government school in the local areas discourages the parents more to spend on their kids, resulting in no education being imparted. What can be done to solve this issue?
I'm so sorry. Could you just repeat this? I'm so sorry.
Okay, sorry. It's okay. She's asking that residents of rural India usually come with little income sources, and their main priorities are basic survival, making education
Yeah.
out of their real. Now, the
Yeah.
lack of government schools in the local area discourages the parents more to spend on their kids, resulting in no education. So, what can be done to solve this issue?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the basic issue that the RT was really trying to solve, right? So when they said, let's do this neighborhood criteria of primary schools in a 1 kilometer radius, secondary schools in a 5 kilometer radius, this was one of those problems that they were trying to solve, to say that we need government schools everywhere, right? And if we don't have them accessible, this is going to continue, right? And then to sort of solve for the problem of, can parents afford to invest in their child's education? So again, like, this is kind of where you see those disadvantages between, say, girl children, boy children, children with disabilities versus without, because within the same household, what's going to happen, and what we know happens, is that where a parent does not have enough money to invest in their child or in their children's education, because like Janisha said, it's all about survival and that's their priority, they are going to choose which child to invest in, right? And if you look at sort of economic theory of why a parent will choose a boy child over a girl child, it's a technically rational decision to make, if I may say so, because so society is sort of saying that your boy child is going to get this education, they're going to earn a living, and then they're going to come back and take care of you, right, in your old age. So as a parent, it is then an economically rational decision to invest in your boy child over your girl child, right? And then to also, I mean, that same sort of motivation is going to encourage a parent, or push a parent rather, to get their girl child married off sooner rather than later, right? And this is also the reason why you'll see more boy children are going to private schools, where parents think that private schools are better than government schools. Parents choose to invest in a private school for their male child, but will send their girl child to a government school, right? So it's all the same problem. It's all that same problem of investment. So over here, what has been done in terms of policy? So something like, say, the conditional cash transfer that I was talking about, right? Conditional cash transfer schemes are basically, you say that, if you enroll your child, right, and if you keep your child in school for X number of years, conditional on that, the government will pay you certain amount of money, right? So it's an incentivization scheme, essentially, the way it works. And so for like investing in education of a girl child, right, the government does have conditional cash transfer schemes that work in this exact way. Often this is then linked to marriage age. So there are a few states that over the years have done, if your girl child is, if your girl child is attending school, so completes 10th grade and does not, is not married at, I think, the age of 80 and then 20, they will pay you a certain amount, right? So these are, for example, ways in which you can encourage that. The other thing that needs to happen 100% on the supply side is that the government needs to make education truly free, right? So the RT Act says that. It says compulsory free elementary education. Those are its conditions, right?
I think there's a technical glitch.
Yeah,
We have lost
Yeah,
ma'am
yeah,
for the moment.
yes. Also, Somesh, when Nisha, we cannot hear you, nor can we see you. Can you hear us and see us?
Yeah, I can. I think my
Maybe it
camera
was a
has
one.
been
It
disabled.
turned has been disabled. Oh,
Ma'am, can you
Yeah,
check?
yeah,
Now it's enabled.
yeah. Is
so
this
sorry.
good?
So sorry. Yes.
So sorry
It
for the
suddenly,
technical, ma'am.
no worries, no worries. Sorry, so where did we lose me?
You you were talking about how parents prefer, educating, the girl
Oh,
child over the boy child, and
right. So I think the last thing I was saying, tell me if you guys heard this bit, was basically
ma'am, you
about
were saying,
making
yeah,
education free, right?
yeah, free
Yeah,
element. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
exactly. So, I mean, what this basically means is that any little thing that can lead to an out-of-pocket expenditure for a household, right? So, for example, if you are telling a parent you need to spend on a uniform, you need to spend on textbooks of a child, these things can potentially dissuade a child from coming to school, right? As in dissuade a parent from investing in their child's education, right? So you need to make it completely barrier-free when it comes to out-of-pocket expenditures, which is really what the RT tries to do. At the same time, something like the midday meal scheme, right? You're saying not only are we going to provide education, we're also going to provide you with a nutritious meal at least one time a day, right? Now we're also advocating for let's do breakfast as well. That's a whole other thing. But yeah, so I mean, these are the ways in which you need to address it, right? If the problem is parents cannot invest in their child's education, then you remove the need for that investment 100%, right? You support them in any way possible. So then the only decision they need to make is my child going to go or not go, right? I don't need to make a decision of do I need to spend, should I invest this money here versus somewhere else? I hope that answers the question. If there was any part of it that I
Yeah,
missed out.
definitely, ma'am. It answered the question. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. Ma'am, but due to the paucity of time, we can't take more questions here. And I thank you so much for answering our doubts and other questions. Now I would like to welcome my co-host, Dhon, for the vote of thanks.
I, Don Chaudhary, take this opportunity to extend my gratitude to our guest, Ms. Nisha Vernekar, for enlightening us with her knowledge. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking time out of your busy schedule and gracing us with your presence. Thank you for sharing your insights on early education, NEP, male and female education that is affected due to COVID, and many other topics. We are grateful for your support. I also wish to thank our faculty